Everybody, thanks for coming out to listen to me talk about filling the Flask a little bit. My name is Jason Myers. That's about all you need to know about me. There's nothing else really important to share there, so there's no about me slide. I'm going to dive right in. I learned a long time ago playing video games, it was important not to try to do everything yourself. Some old man told me, and I took that to heart. I still take that to heart. That's one of the things I think is great about Django, is there's a lot of things built into it. But I kind of prefer a lighter, what I feel like is a lighter weight framework. That doesn't mean you can't make Django do a lot of things like this, but I prefer something lighter. And so I like to look for modules to fill in the gaps to do things that I probably shouldn't do myself, which many people would tell you is any kind of code, but I'm going to assume there are some kinds that I can write, like math, where we just add things. Pretty good at that. I also put this talk together because I think there are a lot of people out there who are like, hey, I'm at full strength when it comes to Python. I got this, right? Like, I beat the Ornica of Tom without the Ornica. Like, totally did that. I beat Zelda. I splashed no clay pots. 0, right? Like, I can do this. Well, I work at home, right? And I have this code reviewer at home. He is the biggest jerk. Like, you don't understand jerk. Jerk. Like, he looks at my code and he's just like, sleep. That's the first thing he does. So I like to keep it as simple as possible, and so I'd like to help you share some things that I hope will fill your empty Flask. So I'm going to talk about, when I say empty, how empty is my Flask when I start. So let's look at that first. I'm literally going to show you 2 files. One is a configuration file that you're probably used to using something similar to store your Flask config, and the other is the actual app that we're going to play with, which is in init.py. By the way, there is a lot of code, but it's all somebody else's, so we're good. All right, so let's look at the init.py. The first thing that I'm basically doing here is getting Flask imported, pulling the config from the config file that we'll look at in a second, and then I'm using this create app thing, this app factory that I pulled from someone else's thing when I Googled Stack Overflow. It apparently creates an app with a specific configuration and then returns it to you, which is pretty epic. So in this case, this is actually going to let me pass in a series of objects, or a single object. It'll pick from a series of them coming from my configuration and apply that configuration to my app. That's kind of nifty because I can have one set of code that does the right thing for development, production, and all those kind of things. So let's look at config.py so that we can kind of get an overview of that. So here I'm pulling in the OS path just to make sure I'm in the right directory. And then I've got a configuration with the most basic Flask config that you can have set. And then I have this development config that just sets the debug flag equal true. When I do this in production, and then I have this config dictionary. That's what it uses to load the config by what I pass in. Cool thing to note, when you flick the slide down over here, it doesn't go over here. There we go. All right, so that's what my config file looks like. So if I don't pass anything in, it's going to take the development config, or if I pass the word development into that create app thing, it'll make the development config, right? In production, I have a production config and a test config, and what's nice about that is I can point it to different databases or different types of databases. I actually, at work, have to deal with both PostgreSQL, Postgres, Postgre, whatever version of that word you would like to use, and MySQL. And so I actually have a test Postgres, a test MySQL in there as well. So the first thing I'd like to talk about with that basic structure in mind is management commands, because we all need a little hope to get things right. And in particular, 2 management commands that I care about are making sure that when I run the local development server, I always run it the same way. And then the second thing is, in Flask, anybody have a problem getting the Flask context into their shell? Like when you're making, you go and you're like, IPython, I'm going to import my app, and no context. It won't do anything, right? So there's this great thing out there called Flask Grip. It creates a manage.py, if you will. It actually names it manage.py for, I guess, so that if you come from Django to Flask, it feels very familiar. It basically gives you a very simple way to build commands that you can execute to do a specific thing. And we'll actually create a couple of them throughout this process. But the first 2 I want to look at are the shell itself. So this is what manage.py looks like. It's basically a simple script. At work, I've flicked this into Click. If you've ever used that, it's another framework, maybe the same person who makes Flask. So I don't do it quite this way, but same concept, right? I have create an app, instance of my app, and then I pass it to manager, and then I just say, great, run that. And when I run it, it's going to give me, just allow me to execute commands off of it. So let's look at creating a shell with a context. So in that same manage.py file, I'll actually import this thing called shell because someone wrote it for me. Again, it's dangerous to go alone. Someone else can do the work. Great, I'll get paid for it. So def, make a shell context. Awesome, that seems pretty straightforward. And in this case, to start with, I'm just going to pass in the app and just say, hey, here's my application context, and pass that into there. So that's essentially what this does. And then I'm adding a command that says, hey, if I type manage.py and shell, I want you to create me a shell in whatever interpreter I'm using. So if I only have Python installed in that virtual environment, it uses Python. If I have IPython, it uses IPython. If I have BPython or Python or whatever random Python interpreter you have, it will use that. If you tried to run Python on Erlang, it would probably try it. I don't know. So here's what that looks like when I run the manage.py. So you can see it's got, by default, it automatically ships that run server command that always runs it the same way. And then it's the shell command that we added by hand there. I feel like that's pretty simple to get like a context shell. Like I've tried to import all the right things in the shell and I never get it right. It's like import Flask and then import the create app and then pass the right thing to create app, but then I forgot to push app like up into global and things go bad. In general, I'm really bad at this. Again, so here's an example of that context I was telling you about. I can actually go in and look at like the app config and those kind of things from inside the shell after adding that simple line to it, right? So let's talk next about database access. It's not very good to have a web framework that doesn't talk to something to store data. I don't care what you store data in. I'm going to show SQLite because it's the fastest. But since we're going to be talking about SQL Alchemy, underneath it, you really can, anything that you can make a connection string will work for this. The guy who wrote Flask actually is the person who wrote this thing called Flask SQL Alchemy. It's a wrapper. Nifty things that it do is it gives you a pre-configured session scope, which means that it knows based on that application what it should have access to. Okay, so like the page that you're on, the life cycle of that object that you pull in is tied to that life cycle of that page. So it's very good about going and querying up data, and then the moment that page is done, the request is executed, it cleans all that up. And you don't have to remember to do that. Again, I'm not a very good programmer, so the simpler I can make it on myself, the better. So again, sessions are tied to the page lifecycle, and it's automatically set that way from the moment you type pip install Flask SQL Alchemy. You don't have to go configure it or any of those things. It just works. So to set this up, we actually need to go back to our init.py. We're going to pull in the Flask SQL Alchemy extension, declare our empty database thing. Now, the rest of this would look like it has the whole time. The only line that really changed here is this db init app and then pass it the application. So that literally ties our database into the thing. And then in config, we need to go tell it what database we want to talk to. So in my development config, I use the super powerful SQLite to get us set up with a very basic database. Straightforward? Excellent. So let's look at a model. How many people are familiar with SQL Alchemy? Fantastic. You raised your hand. That's cheating. All right. So here I'm pulling in that database, right, that I had in my init.py. And I'm going to make a model off of that for cookie, because that is absolute only model we ever need in an application ever. I don't care about your users. I just want cookies. Okay? So this model, most important, make it first every time. You think that's a joke? Check my code or ask any of my former coworkers. All I leave behind are cookies. So here I'm going to set up just a simple model, and everything's coming off of that DB, so I'm not importing anything crazy from SQL Alchemy. All I've done is import just that Flask SQL Alchemy database object that I created in my init.py, and I'm actually saying, hey, this is a model, here's an integer, string, those kind of things to set up very similar to SQL Alchemy. I won't go through it in detail since a lot of you had already familiar with that. What's great about this is I'm not having to remember where all those namespaces for all those SQL Alchemy extensions to do magic are, and I also don't have to think a lot about how I set up my columns. It's pretty straightforward and not a lot of thought involved, which is how I like it. So in manage.py, I want to go create a database in here. So I'm adding a command, right, to my same thing. So underneath where I created the shell context, I'm going to import my database, and I'm going to import my cookies, because, again, there's no other reason. And I'm going to make this command, right? So I'm inheriting from the command object that was provided in Flask Grip. And I have to specify two things. One is an init, and the second is a run. So the init says, is there anything you need set up before I execute the command? What's nifty is here I'm showing just database stuff, but what if you use Paramiko? What if you need to go get a file, a configuration file, or push a config file? You can do all that stuff in this init method, right? While I'm just creating a simple database, I could do anything I needed to in here. So in this case, I'm setting my database equal to the one from the application, and then when you actually run this command, I'm going out and creating that database. So to take a look at an example of what that was, if I run my manage.py with my db init, and then I go into my application-enabled shell, I can actually look at the database metadata, and I will see that there's a table that exists for cookies now. And I can import that model and work with that. In fact, we might as well create a cookie while we're here. Chocolate chip, pretty much hands down the winner, right? That is the first cookie one makes. So here, yes, that's a real place. Here, cookie name, chocolate chip, how many I have, not going to share with you. Add it to the session and then commit it. Again, the nice thing here is I didn't have to configure this session. I didn't have to go like find it or call the session maker or even remember where session maker is in SQL Alchemy. All I have to do is remember that DB is where everything is for my database, and I can pull that in, add it, and commit it, right? So let's go to the next step in databases, because my boss comes to me and he says, Jason, databases cannot be all about cookies. I'm an engineer, so we argued for like 45 minutes, and finally he convinced me that there must be something other than cookies. So Flask Migrate does the same thing that Flask SQL Alchemy does, but for Alembic. So Alembic is a database migration tool, and it will let you do things like detect column changes and add column changes or add big scripts that manipulate the data in place, that kind of thing. It'll allow you to clone databases from one side to the other. It's basically a very flexible way to run scripts against databases, right? So in my manage.py, again, I need to do the same thing I've done several times. Import the commands that I need. In this case, it's migrate, and then I'm going to make a migration command. And then in my create app, I've shortened this down so we don't have to look at it, but, or I'm sorry, not in create app. This is a manage.py. So migrate, and then I have to give it the application I'm working on in the database. And then again, to set up the database migration stuff, I just add another command that tells it, use the migration command from Flask Alembic. Again, very small amounts of code to get a lot of power out of it. If you're familiar with Alembic, you'll be used to running like alembic.init or alembic init to get it started. All of that is hidden underneath this database thing, right? So all of the steps are actually written out in the order that you should run them if you run the help for ManageDB. So you don't even have to think. It's like, do this first, do this next. Like, fantastic. I can follow your instructions. You're really good at this. All right, so let's look at generating a migration. So in this case, I have made a change to my cookies, this is the initial migration. So Python manage.py db, and then migrate, and then, hey, I want to give it a message to say this is the initial migration. It'll go through and do the same output that you're used to seeing with Alembic and then tell you the version that it spit out for you to go play with. And then when I want to run a migration, I just simply say manage.py db upgrade. Right? So what's awesome is, since it's Alembic underneath the hood, all it's doing is connecting it to Flask, which then in turn connects it to SQL Alchemy via the application context. I don't have to remember where I'm at or what I'm passing in. It already knows. As long as my configuration is right. So in this case, when I do this, it's actually looking at that SQL Alchemy URI configuration that's in my development config. That's how it knows what database to work on. Make sense? You can go in and actually say, I want you to run against production, or I want you to run against test, or I want you to run against whatever, just by either setting an environment variable or passing it on the command line. So that's pretty cool. All right, let's talk about user authentication for a second. Now this gets messy, right? Because we have to talk about passwords, and then we actually have to care about users, and I'm still arguing with my engineering manager about cookies. And I really just don't care about users. Not that I don't like users, I just hate models that aren't cookies. That's really all I want to talk about. So, last login is a super simple way to deal with this. Now, having said that, this one doesn't make everything quite as easy as some of the other ones. It actually wants us to go like create a user model and not talk about cookies. Although it does protect session cookies, and I'm all about cookie protection, so I'm good with that. No, truthfully, it allows us to have simplistic decorators that we don't have to go build ourselves, and it provides a real simple way to just say, this user passed my authentication, log it in, right? Flask login is strictly about authentication. It's not about authorization. It's not about accounting, right? It's just about authentication. So pip install it, Flask login, and then let's go look at init.py because that's where the magic happens. We're going to pull in login manager, initialize it without an application context, and then in our Flask factory here, we are going to pull that in and actually set it up as an application. Now, you guys familiar with Flask blueprints? Never used those before, so I'm kind of lazy. And I like to copy code from other people's places, and if I can do that if I use blueprints. I can kind of grab what they did and then like pull it into my code and then just hook it up. So there is a directory in my in line with the Flask field. In that directory, in that directory, there's another directory called main. I import main as a blueprint, and then I just say register it as a blueprint. Now we'll go look at that main init file so that you can see what's going on the other side of that in just a second. But basically, this is a way for me to take two separate packages and pull them together into one application without having to like actually code, go import this thing from down in here and grab all the models for it, like without having to do all that. This just lets me say, hey, there's this other module over here, you should pull it into here and pretend it's part of you, right? So it's basically just connecting the two of them. I do the same thing for auth, except for I passed in a URL prefix because I wanted everything in the auth module to start with /auth. And again, give me 1 second, we'll come back to the other side of that connection. So let's look at models. First, I have to define this user model. I don't write code to generate passwords. Again, I get it, you beat the Orinka of Tom without the Orinka, whatever, great. I can't do that. So Wurtzoig has a couple of password functions that do the right thing out of the box. And in fact, if you install Flask Login, they're already configured to do even better things out of the box, like use the appropriate level, number of cycles on the encryption and that kind of stuff. So here I'm going to start creating my user. And I've got this user mix-in. I'll come back to that in just a second and explain more about it. But this comes from the login module from Flask Login and allows me just to simply throw in a mix-in that defines most of the things that are required. And then all I have to do on top of that is add in some sort of ID, a username, password field, and then this authenticated field. This doesn't even ever have to be used. It just has to be present. It's a hangover from an older version of Flask login that may or may not go away. But at the moment, it's required. So I need those, the ID, and then those three fields in order for that to work. Now, I talked about user mix-in. What user mix-in is effectively doing is providing is the user active? Can I get its ID? Is it authenticated? And is it anonymous? Right? Like that's the function. Pulling in user mix-in is basically doing these four things for us, right? It's going to answer those four questions when Flask asks. So digging further into the user model, let's talk about passwords. Again, I don't allow password to be a readable attribute, so I define it as a property. Look at that, PEP 8. Someone's dying. Again, I'm bad at this, okay? But that would compile, so we're okay. All right, so in this case, I'm going to raise an attribute error if they try to access password directly, but if they try to set it, I'm going to run it through that generate password hash that I pulled in from Wurtzoig. And then same thing for verify, I'm going to use the check to do the same thing. Again, it's little code for me as possible. I've seen people come in here and try to like PDBK2, all kinds of magic in this. And I don't even know what that means, but it sounds awesome, but it's not a cookie, so I don't care. So this generate password hash, super fast, super efficient. All kidding aside, this really does go down and run depending on what system you're on, either PDBK2 or AES or something like that to encrypt the passwords. It's doing it way smart. If I quit playing up the dumb for a second, it's doing nifty things. All right, so here's that other side of that blueprint I promised I'd show you. So this is the other side on auth, right? So the auth module lives in the Flask field directory, and it has a file in it called views, right? So this is the other side of the blueprint. So when we imported auth into our init.py and said, hey, this is a blueprint, all I had to do to hook that into this existing code was to add auth equal blueprint, tell it what its name is, and then pass it the module name, and then it would know how to wire those two together. That is one of the more magical pieces of Flask. All it's essentially doing is changing the resolution order, the MRO, to say, go here. So not as complicated as it seems. So in my views, I've got to import like half of Flask, but more importantly, from Flask login, I need the login user, logout user, and then login required. I'm also going to go ahead and pull in my user model. So let's look at the actual login function that I would use to do this. So I allow get and post. You're going to see some of my expert web development skills here, so control yourself, okay? I know this is going to be mind-numbing, but work with me. So I got a form that gives me a username and password. I'm going to like filter to make sure that it exists. If there is a user and I can verify its password, then I'm going to log it in and then tell it where to go next, or I'm going to redirect it to whatever the main application is. Otherwise, I'm going to give it a thing saying you did the wrong thing, and then that's the template that we're going to render when you access that view. Make sense? All right, logout's very much the same. It's just a thing saying you've been logged out and then kicking you out. The important part is that you call login like we did in the other one, and then you call logout here. One other important thing is that your logout needs to be login required. Anybody know why that is? This is actually a cool question. Why do you have to be logged in to log out?
Somebody doesn't log you out.
So someone doesn't log you out. Well, that's a good point. What's interesting is that if you have session cookies, even if they're well scrambled, you can still log someone else out if the logout isn't required. So if you don't require the session and the cookie to match, someone else can actually steal your cookie and do things to you. So it's kind of an odd thing. So my login template, again, awesome HTML, right? I've got some random base template. Trust me, it's amazing. I'm just setting a title and then creating a simple form that's using templates to grab my data back over, right? And then just some links for resetting password and that kind of stuff. So let's look at main.view or main views, because that's what's going to happen when you log in. So when they go in, they enter their username and password. I'm going to redirect them to main.index you saw there. So that's what this is. So main.index is this, and this just returns a nice little HTML function when you ask for it. Again, this is what the view looks like when it's being used in a blueprint. And this index template does exactly what you think. If the user is not authenticated, it asks them to log in. If they are authenticated, it asks them to log out. Manager said, we need login, logout. He's got it. Nothing else. All right, create users, migration, and play with it. So I added that user model, right? But it's not in my database yet. Does that make sense? So I need to actually go in and do the DB migrate for user, right? And that'll generate me a migration that I can turn right around, and it'll actually tell me, if you had the full output here, it would actually say, like, you should probably run DB upgrade next. So I did, because I assumed it knew what it was talking about, and it does. And it added the user model to my database for me, so I don't have to mess with it. So now I'm going to run the server with Python manage py run server. And then, again, I told you my design was kind of amazing. Trust me, no JavaScript errors. ES6 compliant right here. Look at it. Does it fit in that window? What phone is that? Is that like a Nokia? Like somewhere, someone's with a StarTAC flip phone? Like, I got this. This works. Trust me, web designer. All right, so login page, again, equally epic. But more importantly, when you submit the right thing here, it's going to take you to tell you who you are and then offer you a chance to log out, right? And then once you've logged out, the fancy message to say, you logged out, yay. And if you do the wrong thing, you'll get the nice wrong username, password, the same thing that we said in the Flask. So what do you think? Is that too much code to get that or not enough code to get that? I like using the Flask login. Now, you can go a step further, and we're actually going to talk about that as well in a second. I like Flask login because it lets me use the boilerplate that we used in the examples there. The one thing that causes me sometimes to use Flask security, which is another step up from Flask login, is occasionally I'm worried about the people who are going to be hitting it. So if it's external, I tend to go Flask security because it's been 1 time more better. It has like 6 more stars on GitHub. It must be epic. No, it legitimately is better. It's more tuned to things that are going to be outwardly exposed. If I'm writing something that's internal, not going to be external facing, but I still want good level set security on it, Flask login provides that for me. So you guys saw my epic HTML form. I mean, that thing was like amazing, right? So let's talk about forms next. Now, I am not about to cuss, okay? So I will not say the name of this next module because I don't want to get hurt, okay? So Flask form stuff. There is an actual, what the forms is the actual name of the module this is using, right? Like that's a real thing. I'm not just like some kind of evil person. What's nice about this is built-in validation, built-in CSRF. I don't even know how that works. Does anybody know how that works? Like there's a token thing and yeah, whatever. And built-in file loads. So if I pip install Flask WT forms, that will work too, I think. I hope so. I can go build a form. So this is back in my auth blueprint, right? Pull into the form and then string field, password field, and then the submit field. And then I have a couple of validators to make sure that it's present and how long it is, because I don't want it to be too long. I don't want usernames that someone like went really crazy with playing. It's like the joke about the QA guy that like ordered a beer, then a vodka, and then a 1, and then like a QFT4 or something. Like I want it to just kind of like be in a normal form. So here, creating a form, assigning some validators to each of the fields, and then this will replace my nasty HTML form that I had. Whoops, wrong button. That's the right one. All right. So in my views now, I've changed all of that grabbing the username and password stuff from the form into just, here's a form, validated on submit. So Flask knows the difference between when the form data is filled and when it isn't. That's getting passed in on the request. So it says, okay, if there's request.form, fine, put it into this form login form, and then validate it. If it passes, great, continue on. So all of that logic I had about if none, making sure the username and password had all the right things in it that I didn't do in the first form, because again, I'm lazy. They're all done for me. All the like client-side things I should have done are taken care of. And if I go look at my auth login HTML, I had to like do more work, which is terrible. But simply adding a form token, make sure that that token is valid. And then for each of the fields, I added a label, then the actual text box itself or the form box itself for them to fill out. And then I added a space for if there are errors for that field to show that, right? All right, make sense? So that worked exactly like I could show you more epic HTML screens if you want to see them, but like that worked exactly like the prior one, just with a form that would have gave us validation. So I'm going to skip that for just 1 second and move to authorization and save you another view of my lovely HTML code. Authorization is different than authentication. Authentication says, am I allowed in here? Authorization says, am I allowed access to this thing, right? We're going to look at something called Flask Principal here. Now, I didn't put a lot of bullets underneath this because if you visit this website, it may spontaneously cause your brain to implode because there are like graphs like with circles and lines. And this Java person wrote this, maybe? I don't know. Just kidding. That's not a slam against Java people. It just like this was really well thought out. All right. They put a lot of thought into how do we block people from doing the wrong things. And because they put a lot of thought into it, they also wrote the documentation with all of that thought in it, which does violate my first principle of only thinking about cookies, but I needed something to solve this, and I wasn't going to write it myself. So Flask Principal fits that model. It's actually a lot simpler than the website makes it look like, so come back to this one later. It's worth it. So init.py, again, principal, and then setting the init app inside of our create app function. In our models, now we need a role, right? I think most of you said you were familiar with SQL Alchemy. The only thing I have kind of weird here is this join table. It's a many-to-many, kind of like table to connect the two together. It's an intermediary table to get all fancy. But it just basically associates users and roles together. And I'm going to make a change to my user class that adds a roles relationship to it. So sorry. So I'm adding a relationship to role, basically telling it to go use that secondary table to join on user ID against the roles user ID. And then on the roles, this back reference will actually make it so that if I say role.user, it will give me all of the users that have that role. So it connects them to both ways. And then I need to decide what happens when someone logs in, all right? So when someone logs in, I actually need to like connect this authorization information to them, right? So in this case, I'm going to set the identity of the user to whatever their current username is. Then if the current user has an ID, I'm going to go say it provides a user need authorization for that user ID, okay? So that allows me to say this view requires this user. Does that make sense? So user need is a way to say, I have to have this user to do this view. I'll come back to that in a second. Then I say, if this user has roles, for each one of those roles, I want you to say, this user provides, right? So the identity for this user provides a role needed of whatever the role name is. Why did I use role names but user IDs? We don't ever want something logged or output that I can associate back to a name. So like all my usernames are Marvin, That was the dog at the beginning, sorry. So I don't want to have Marvin like 900 times in my logs, because that's my password too, and people will figure it out. The user need of an ID is just to hide the username so that you don't have to deal with it. And then the list of roles will provide the roles needed. So now I have this identity object, right? That's in the Flask request tied to the user that says, if I encounter a user needed authorization step, he provides this ID's or she provides this ID's user information. Or if I have a role needed authorization request, it provides these role names. Make sense? So let's go look at auth views now. I want to create this identity record when someone logs in. So I've gone in, and all of this is the same except for this line right here. This identity change line right here, we actually send it. I know this looks crazy complicated. It's not, trust me. That's a lie. All right, so current underscore app here, and then get the current object. That basically says, what user object am I messing with, right? You're saying, why didn't you just pass user there? Well, what if I told you it was possible to lie about what user you presented to me? That is doable. There's no login required. I can't be 100% sure what you gave me is what you actually are. So that's why we use this. This says, Flask, what is the current object we are working on, period. I don't care what the user said. Flask, what are we currently playing with, right? We take that object and we say, okay, great, it's identity changed, run it through that identity function, and then apply this identity to it. So that actually calls that identity signal that we had earlier. Does that make sense? So this is what connects its login back to this identity loader. All right, now, one last thing. In the auth piece, we have the ability to set permissions, right? That's the whole point of authorization. So in my authorization, I have a permission that I want to require an admin role for. That's exactly what that line does, right? This makes me an admin permission that sets that up. Now what's great about this is I can now use that as a function decorator, and more specifically in Flask as an endpoint decorator, right? So now I have a settings route where I can go in and change things. Given my awesome HTML, you can imagine what I allow them to change. But they can go in and change things. And I can require that admin permission just by simply saying admin permission require. I can also say, instead of admin permission require, I could also say a permissions required and then put in a list of permissions I'd like to require, right? And I can do that either with the role need, like I did for admin position. In the prior, I can either add a bunch of role needs in there, or I can simply add admin permission and whatever I created that list of. Does that make sense? This seems like a bit of code, right? But let's really go back for 1 second. It's really not a lot of code. We add a roles class, right? We add the roles to the user. We add the identity loader. We make sure login triggers the identity loader, and then we add the role that we want for admin. That's it. Then we're using it. But think about what's actually occurring in Flask behind this. We have now gotten so specific that you can't send me a false piece of information that I care about because I don't trust you. I only rely on Flask to tell me the right thing. That's hard to code. Like to physically think about, I get this input, I only want this thing. If I didn't use this, I probably wouldn't code that the right way, right? In fact, Django does this and hides it so well you don't even know it's happening. But if you were to go look at the Django code, it's quite a bit of code. They've done some serious effort to make it work that way. These permission decorators, who's added permission decorators in Django? Has anybody had that fun? It's a little bit of work, isn't it? About this much work, actually, to do the same, to get the same level of protection that this is offering. Again, these permissions are tied against SQL Alchemy. They're tied against Flask. They're tied against Flask login, and they're tied against Flask principal. So they're actually going to get validated. If you go through the code, they're actually getting validated 4 times before it says, yes, you can actually visit this page. And in a bunch of different ways. So more awesome coding. Let's look at what happens when you try to access something without it. It actually returns a nice permissions denied error. Now, I think there are probably coders out there that know how to do web things. And they can fix this to like it shows a nice error page and says you're not allowed here. But essentially, it's just going to throw an error. And then it will tell you, hey, I'm looking for a role with admin. You didn't have that, right? It won't tell you what you did have. It won't give any of that information away. So as a developer who's writing code to handle this permission denied, you don't have access to know what they had, but you know what they didn't have, right? So defensive coding, right? We can't share information we don't know. So you can't accidentally say, well, you had these, but you didn't have this one. And if you do have the right thing, then you get a lovely settings page where you can do nothing. Any questions about login? I feel like that's confusing sometimes. Fantastic. All right, let's look at sending mail. So I used to work at Emma. They send a little bit of mail. They're an email like marketing and analytics firm. So they send a lot of mail, actually. And so Flask Mail is a way to do that at a small level. If you have to send a large amount of mail, this is not the thing you want to do. So Flask Mail, again, we're going to pip install it. And then once we have it installed, we're going to do the same thing. Notice this pattern. I like things where I can copy and paste. This is like, I like this. So in my init.py, I'm initializing mail. And then also in my init, did I manage to make the same slide? Look at that. I'm amazing. OK. So in main views, I'm going to create a thing that says mail me. I want a message about cookies, clearly. So I've got a route that says mail me. And then instead of having to do all the SMTP server setups and having to make import all the MOM setups and all those kind of things, Flask Mail just gives me this message object. And I pass message a subject, who it's from, who it's going to, and that can be a list or it can be a singular item if I want just one. And then I have two things here that I need to set in order for the message to be fully validate RFC-wise. I need to set both the body and the HTML. I don't share cookies, so I'm sending you a message to let you know they're all mine. And then I simply just call mail.send. Now, what's great about this is all of the configuration settings for Flask Mail are all set in that same config object. So in my development config, in my production config that I showed you at the very beginning, I can put all of those in there separated by the instance that they're on. So if you use something like SendGrid or Mailgun or any of those kind of things to send email, this will work against all those and keep your configuration separated by environment. So if you have a test sandbox and those kind of things, kind of nice. No weird switching or no weird use of environment variables to get there. All right, so what else is out there? We've talked about several different things that cover most of my use cases, but let's talk about a couple of other things. The first is Flask Security. So Flask Security basically takes Flask Mail, Flask Login, Flask Principal, Flask SQL Alchemy, and puts them all into one package. Then it adds this entire registration system, and then it adds accounting. So if you need to have full AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting, Flask Security will do that for you. It will actually track this person has visited this many times, their login failed this many times. It will do all of those things that you want to do. It makes registration forms, auto builds password failures, and you can override all those templates and all that kind of stuff. So it's really good if you want one place to do it all. Now, the disadvantage is you lose all the flexibility of pulling those pieces in separately, right? So you agree to abide by the way they want you to work to. But the documentation is really good, and it leverages the libraries underneath it instead of like re-implementing them. So you get the nice community reviewed of all the individual libraries all kind of wrapped into one thing. And then time zones, anybody really good at those? I can't even tell you like when my coworkers on the West Coast actually start working. So Flask Moment is a way, if you're familiar with Moment.js, they've brought that concept into Flask so that manipulating time zones is a lot simpler than trying to like use time delta and storing everything in UTC and then pulling it out. It just does the right thing from the beginning so that you don't have to think about it as much. If you're looking for more, there is this thing called Awesome Flask that's out on GitHub. Thankfully, if you search for Awesome Flask, it's the first thing that comes up. So it's just a list of all the other Flask logins that a lot of people have gone through and said, I like this, I don't like this. So if you have other things that you like, you should definitely go make sure they get added to there. If there are some on there you don't like, you should tell us why you don't like them. So hopefully your Flask is a little fuller than it was when you got here, but still not like capped off because I'm sure you've got your own things to do. And do you have any questions after you take a moment to digest that slide? Any questions?
Can you please go back to the slide with the URL for that awesome meeting?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You're welcome. There is quite a list out there. I tend to do mostly API development, but if you do any kind of front end, there's quite a list of like hooking Flask into different JavaScript frameworks. What is the one that's all the rage right now? React. There's a thing like Flask React that sets the page life cycles to agree with one another. It's pretty nifty. Some of my coworkers love that. Yep.
So for building, let's say JSON or REST interfaces, you said you do mostly Flask there. Do you have a...
There is Flask RESTful.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have totally done that. His question was, since I do a lot of API work, what packages would I use to build APIs with? There is Flask RESTful, which is out there. If you like a very strict definition of REST, that'll help you implement that. The one thing that's really nice about that is if you do have to do JSON and XML and other formats, it's kind of got that baked in. I tend to have to do very limited, like dump this to JSON. It works for our team. So most of my endpoints don't have to go all the way to Flask RESTful. But when I do, that is what I use. So all of our customer-facing stuff that I write has that in it, but everything internal is dumps to JSON because that's all they want. Yeah, man.
What is your preferred way to do async anything with Flask?
The question was, what is my preferred way to do anything async with Flask? I tend to not. If we're getting async, I tend to go find Tornado. Well, that's the wrong way to sell Flask, isn't it? No. Proper tools for proper jobs, right? I think Tornado, for me, is better for that mindset, for the way my brain works. It's the same reason why I picked Flask over Django. My brain works this way. I like the little pieces going together to make a thing instead of a big piece that I got to pull out what I want. Cookie principle. Small nibbles of a cookie that contain exactly what I want versus cake. So same thought. I would use Tornado for that. I wouldn't even think about Flask. Does Flask do async, like for real? Is there an async IO or a G-evented Flask now? No? Okay, yeah. Tornado is my go-to.
And it's very fun to try
To do it?
Yeah.
That would be a good talk. How I tried to async Flask.
Maybe I should do a lightning.
That would be a good one. Like I would want to see that. What other questions? Absolutely. It's out on SlideShare, and all my slides are on GitHub, and I actually turned all the code that I showed you into a repo called FlaskField under my GitHub. So if you go to GitHub and then Jason A. Myers, the top like 2 or 3 things out there will be my PyOhio presentation called Filling the Flask, and the very next one will be FlaskField. And I structured the commits in that so that every single module I talked about is in one commit. So you can actually see the code grow as you progress through it, right? Again, I like small little pieces I can understand, so I chunked it up that way. Other questions? If not, you can find me on Twitter at Jason A. Myers. I wrote a book, if you're interested, about SQL Alchemy. I like it, so. Otherwise, thank you very much.